And so we come to the last lecture based on your textbook. It always seems impossible at the beginning of the term, and then it's so quick when it comes around. So we're going to be looking at chapter 12 as the basis: globalization, McDonaldization, and corporatism. And many of these issues overlap with ones that we have been discussing already, which makes sense as we're all living in the same world, and these thinkers often knew each other and read each other. So I've been using each section to kind of highlight certain important ideas, but I do want you to know they do overlap, of course. And so the question that Mann asks for this section is, what does it mean to be globalized, McDonaldized, and corporatized? Should we fight these changes? So this particular section, I think almost more than any of the others, really indicates the way that no textbook can keep up with what's going on in society. By the time something's even printed, the whole thing may have changed. And not that it's changed completely, but certainly, as he states in the beginning, this was 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s. This was really central sort of social theory, economic theory, political theory. But as I'm sure you are aware, we've seen huge changes happening. So, for instance, a lot of the issues around the United States as being kind of the hegemon and the power, the one global superpower, are increasingly being questioned in our time. So I'll touch on that as we go along, but just know that the theory, we're never quite caught up as much as we can try. But nonetheless, these are important theories that for us to understand and look at. In the first section of the chapter, Mann gives a very good overview of just these complex forces that have led us to the point where we're at today. And I did discuss a number of them in our very first lecture, so I'm not going to go over that part of industrialization, the move out of feudalism. I assume you know that. But I do want to just touch on some of these more in the 20th, 21st century. So just to give the absolute background, the Industrial Revolution and imperialism result in the growth of industry and global markets, with most of the profit going to Western nations. So this is an ongoing issue, and when we looked at Said and post-colonial theory, we can see many of them would argue that in some ways, we're not really even post-empire. Certainly, the argument can be made that the United States is acting like an imperial power around the world. And also, the way these markets have been created continue to give advantage, usually to the West. That's changing, obviously, with the power of China. But nonetheless, we see that this has often worked, certainly for certain parts of the Western world. So the shocks of World War I, the Depression, World War II, resulted in a complete reshaping of the global order after that. And we see that some countries respond with creating some version of the welfare state. So I talked about this already in the case of Canada. Old age pension, unemployment insurance, in the case of Canada, universal health care. These kind of social safety nets were a reaction to just the incredible destructiveness of the Depression and what happens if you don't have those social safety nets. Even the United States, we see the New Deal that came out of the Second World War. And so in both Canada and the United States, the GIs coming back from the war were given free education. They were often given subsidized housing. Many of you will live in towns, we used to call them wartime houses. A lot of them are getting knocked down, but little houses that were given to these returning soldiers. And so all of these efforts to make sure that what happened after World War I didn't happen again. So a really important aspect of this economically is the Bretton Woods. And this is something, when you come across it, you think, wow, these conspiracy theory people are correct. And I've always had these sort of dark wonderings about, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, but we can see here that this is an actual historical moment in time after World War II. So after World War II and the collapse of Europe, America moves into that complete position, other than of Soviet Russia, of power in the world. And so they gain control basically of the world economic system. So for instance, the national currencies were pegged to the US dollar. Again, this is in flux. We're hearing a lot, or I'm reading a lot about countries saying maybe we need to not do that anymore. So this was due to the fact that when the war ended in 1945, the US was the dominant economic and political power in the world. The Americans had about 60% of the world's gold in their vaults in Fort Knox. Imagine that. So we see the whole economic order is being determined by the United States, at least from World War II onward. And so Bretton Woods creates the International Monetary Fund, along with the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which later becomes the World Bank. And certainly if I'm looking at it from the point of view of colonial critique, countries like India, many countries were forced to restructure their economies as a result of debt owing to these institutions. So there's a huge amount of criticism of these institutions and the way they favor Western countries, particularly the US and Europe. So I'll leave you to read through that. That's quite complex about the global economy, but just know that we see the Americans are in a very powerful position. And as I said, things appear to be changing. And so if any of you read or watched the speech by our Prime Minister, Mark Carney, at Davos, that was the shot heard around the world. In my life, I have never seen sort of international people responding to a Canadian Prime Minister in that way. And I was at a kiosk in the mall, and the woman that was selling me my magazine said, "Did you hear the speech?" You don't usually hear Canadians saying things like that. So everybody was listening to the speech. And he said, this is a point of rupture. So this whole order that we have depended on since World War II is basically no more. So some people saw that as kind of exaggerated rhetoric. Obviously it's too soon. It hasn't even been a year since he gave that speech. We don't know. But it does appear that with the current government in the United States, that this, just out of self-defense, many of the rest of the world, the countries in the rest of the world, are delinking themselves from the United States in a variety of ways. So we're right in the middle of this, but it does appear like we're in the middle of a complete reshaping of the world order. We're going to turn now to the writing and thought of George Ritzer, who's an American sociologist, very, very influential, who taught at the University of Maryland. And he's written many textbooks on sociology. I remember using his textbook when I was in undergrad. And so he's been very influential in talking about these ideas about McDonaldization. So in your textbook, this is very clever here. On page 393 says, "In the court of the Burger King." So you entered the swinging doors of Burger King at 12:15 p.m. with less than an hour to eat lunch. Up to the counter you go, where a chirpy teenager greets you with, "How are you today, sir?" You ignore the standardized greeting. You just know he's being a curmudgeon here. But a smile at her royal purple uniform and the crown-shaped plastic badge on her label that reads, "Hi, my name is Brittany." You order the burger royale with cheese, the king-size fries, and an imperial gallon of cola. You strum your fingers on the counter absent-mindedly for 2 minutes as Brittany smiles the same smile she already smiled 100 times today. Then your food magically arrives. Okay, so he's giving this as, I'm sure we have all experienced this, an example of what it is to go into a fast food establishment anywhere in the world. It would be almost identical. So on page 394 and 395, Mann gives a good overview of what he means by McDonaldization. So the idea of efficiency being key, calculability being key, predictability being key, and control. Okay, so he goes on to say, it can provide a wide variety of goods to a lot of people. You don't have to worry about where you are in order to consume most McDonaldized products. For example, with internet markets like Amazon, all you need is a computer. It provides products quickly. Okay, so this is the world that many of us live in, even if we're pushing against it. And so these are the kind of the concepts. So he's able to pull out those organizing concepts of the world we live in. Certainly, I've talked a lot about the idea that in places like North America, efficiency is like a god. It's more important than anything. It's more important than quality. It's more important than quality of life. It's got to be efficient. So that it was North America that came up with the great idea of the drive-through. So you can you can drive and eat at the same time. I'm using this photograph, which I was really excited to find this photograph. So this is Vatican City in the background in Italy. And then you see the McDonald's sign. And so to me, this was a perfect juxtaposition of these two world orders, right? The Vatican, these old buildings that you would see in countries like Italy that are absolutely stunningly beautiful. I mean, people travel thousands of miles to look at these buildings. And then McDonald's, which would be the same, whether it's in Bangkok, in Thailand, it doesn't matter. And so I think it should come as no surprise to you that it has been countries like Italy that have pushed back against this. So this idea that when you go to any country, you see the same 5 stores. It's very demoralizing, right? It's like, why am I traveling if I'm just seeing the same American chain stores everywhere I go? Or Canadian, doesn't matter. And so, for instance, just to give you an idea of the pushback, it was Italy that developed the whole idea in response to seeing these fast food outlets opening there. And you must know this country has a very, very long-standing food culture. Developed what's called the slow food movement. And this has become a very influential movement in all areas of life around the globe, of people saying, let's slow down. Maybe we don't need to be as efficient as we are, and go back to these kind of local traditions, imagine a world without these food traditions. Imagine if, all these food traditions that were obliterated by fast food. It's horrifying. And I really hope you're not participating in this. I suspect you are. But certainly, if I look around in North Bay, there's places like Greco's. That's like many generations of that family serving Italian food. So it's never been a complete victory, but certainly in North America, many, many people, a huge amount of their diet is going to these places, coming from these places. And this has implications not only for our society, but for the health of our society, because we know that consumption of fast food and processed food is directly linked to all sorts of chronic health problems. I want to look at the Globalization of Nothing by Ritzer. It's published in 2004, and this is an impassioned kind of cri de coeur of him looking at this with clearly being appalled. And this is a very, very influential book, and people use that word, McJobs, McDonaldization. It's come into the common vocabulary. So he's actually been extremely influential, and he's also seeded a lot of protest movements, or at least contributed to them. So he writes, the mass production of nothing is closely related to branding. So we see, I've talked about this already, that idea of the manufacturing base being shipped abroad because it's cheaper and there's no labor laws, or very few labor laws. And so essentially we see a consumer society that are, in his view, just buying a whole lot of nothing. And so if that's the case, then branding is necessary, because who's going to buy nothing? So he says this is clearest in the case of non-things, for example, Nike shoes. And so he gives this really interesting examination, analysis of this, and the way that these companies, and we know, they hire psychologists, they hire people, anthropologists, and they really work on, they use symbols, right? We know how human beings, I talked about that in the religion section, that's a natural thing that human beings do. They respond to symbols. So Nike, as you will probably know, is a Greek goddess of victory, right? So linking these sneakers to this ancient archetype of victory, right? So we talked about this in terms of the truck imagery and how it gets linked to masculinity and productivity and so on, and how it gets linked to a lifestyle. But it also applies to non-places like Nike towns, and I would put just like Disneyland, these kind of non-places. They're not real towns. They have no locality. A brand, especially one that is successfully marketed and imprinted in the mind of consumers, often serves to differentiate that which has little or no difference from its competitors. So he's saying, look at all these sneakers, they're all the same. So the only way to get people to buy them and pay huge amounts of money is to brand them in a variety of ways. And you get, a sports star to sell them for you in commercials and so on. So we see this huge expansion of the advertising industry, and I have touched on this already. That began really in the 1920s, but it's hit its peak in our time period, where you almost can't avoid them. If you live in a big city, they're on the walls of the buildings. If you open your computer, they pop up. And so he's actually way ahead on this one in terms of that you have to brand things, and then the influencers come in and do the work of shilling those pieces of nothing. So on page 60 of the Globalization of Nothing, he has, it's very provocative, his subtitles, Analyzing People, Non-People. Bartenders in traditional taverns tend to be unique, one-of-a-kind characters. They have distinct personalities, are likely to be personally well-known to customers, especially regulars, and they get to know their clientele quite well. Beyond perhaps the bar owner, if different from the bartender, there is no centralizing organization conceiving of what bartenders should say and do and controlling their actions. This is clearly not true of the Disney cast member. The Disney Corporation is very powerful and is notorious for the control that it exercises over employees. Any number of people can and have donned the Mickey Mouse or Snow White costume and have wandered about the park greeting visitors. Those who play these parts are interchangeable, and while each must invest his or her performance with some individuality, what each does is scripted and choreographed. Okay, so here's this idea coming onto individual people. So the difference between going into a Burger King and going into a restaurant that's owned by, say, somebody in your community or a community family. We all know that's a very different feeling, and especially if you go there regularly and you get to know them. So Ritzer is saying that, I mean, it's been all countries, but mostly the United States has been sort of sending out these various brands around the world, and these various, Starbucks and McDonald's and so on around the world. So he sees it, I would say, I don't know if he says this directly, but it's a kind of weird economic imperialism. So I want to look at the concept of globalization, and this one, again, in our time period is being hotly debated. A lot of critiques, and a lot of the social movements on all sides of the political spectrum are coming out of a critique of this. So it builds on McLuhan's idea of the global village. As we have discussed, he was extremely prophetic in what he was predicting, particularly with the internet. And so we have the possibility of a global consciousness. So thinking beyond, I think I talked about this, that our grandparents, great-grandparents probably didn't move far from where they were born, right? So this idea that you can even think like this, think of the whole globe. And you think of when you, like if I log on to CBC, I'm just seeing the whole globe before me and all the horrible things that are happening. I'm sure there are good things too, but that's not what they tend to focus on. The relative freedom of travel and interaction. This is a tricky one. I've had discussions with people about this. I think this, in many ways, is an illusion. Obviously, if you have a Canadian passport, you can go to a lot of places. But even then, you can't stay there. And I think this is an illusion people have. You can't just, this is going on in Mexico right now. So many Canadians and Americans have moved there. The Mexicans are like, get out of here, right? Because they have to organize their own country for the good of their citizens. So this is a kind of an illusion that we just can move around. There's only a few very elite people that really can do it like that. Very wealthy people. Multiculturalism. So certainly this in Canada becomes sort of overarching idea of our country, that it's many other countries have imitated us actually in embracing this. Now this is another one that is coming under direct threat by various political movements that reject this. So this is happening right now. Canada, at least outside of Quebec, seems to be holding firm to this belief that we should have a multicultural society. Increased commodification in all parts of life. So I've already touched on that with McDonaldization. So that idea that the profit motive is coming into just all sorts of parts of our life. So I'll just give an example. There's been a lot of controversy about YouTube influencers filming their children, for instance. And so they're making money as content off of their children. Now, there are always stage parents. That's not a new thing. But certainly the idea that you're trying to commodify everything is very much of our time. Threat to local cultures, I touched on that. McDonaldization is just one version of that, but where, say, local, so India, known for textiles, many countries are known for their own textiles and knitting and so on, and that those are under threat of being obliterated. Now, many places I know, I believe in Iceland, the government has moved to, actually, it's amazing, to protect knitting patterns because each community has their own knitting patterns. And so they've made an actual concerted effort to make sure that these cheap goods from other countries won't just wash that away. But that takes a lot of effort, and not all countries sort of see that as something worth saving. So it's been interesting to me to see that UNESCO now has the idea of there's sort of heritage and culture that it seeks to protect. So it's not just buildings, it's actually culture, so music, art, and so on. Supposed shift from nation state to transnational. This, I remember this discussion, and everybody's like, that's how it's going to be. There won't be nation states. Turns out that doesn't work. And I really think this is at the heart of a lot of the right-wing backlash, that human beings need a sense of place. They need a sense of community. And if you do away with that, they feel extremely disoriented. And I'm going to build on this when we get to Zygmunt Bauman, because he talks about this. So certainly we have not seen the fading of the nation state. If anything, it's become stronger. Reduction of barriers to international trade. So that certainly from the 1980s until recently was being touted as the ideal, right? And so that there would just be open so-called free trade. Then electronic, digital, global financial markets. So this one's a weird one, and some of you may know people like this. So in my lifetime, last 10 years or so, you hear just normal people talking about, the stock market, and they're watching their stocks, and that would never have happened when I was there. It would only be very few people, and they were considered like unusual. But now, we're all supposed to be doing this. It's very, very odd. And so it's all electronics, all digital, it's 24/7. And you get this very pernicious phenomenon of currency trading across nation states. So you can see that lack of national boundaries is beneficial to a certain group of people. Neoliberal economic ideas and deregulation. So this is ongoing. We see our government just use this contretemps with the United States as an excuse to deregulate on environmental policies. So this continues, these neoliberal economic ideas that the only way to be financially successful is to just open it all out and deregulate it. So some of these are in flux and some have been maintaining themselves. I want to turn now to the work of Zygmunt Bauman, who is an absolutely fascinating thinker. And I think his life obviously speaks to the work that he creates. So he's Polish-born sociologist, considered one of the most influential intellectuals in Europe, and I'd say beyond, known for works that examine broad changes in the nature of contemporary society. He focused primarily on how the poor and dispossessed have been affected by social change. So you can see that, like Ritzer, that humanitarian, like many of our thinkers that we've looked at, this humanitarian aspect of the work. So his own life story, of course, shapes what he ends up writing about. Bauman and his family escaped to the Soviet Union in 1939 after Germany invaded Poland, and during World War II, he fought in a Polish army unit under Soviet command. He also was a member of a Stalinist organization and dedicated to extinguishing resistance to communism. Now he changes, and we'll get to that. He returned to Poland after the war, where he eventually faced anti-Semitism and moved to Israel briefly, and then in 1971 was hired at the University of Leeds in England, and where he retired from in 1990s. So this just incredibly dramatic life story. And so, for instance, I've used his work a lot, or looked at a lot of his work, and he has a whole section where he talks about the way that the Weberian iron cage of bureaucracy, rationality, and how the Nazis used that, and how they used that to very efficiently commit genocide. And so he's one of the the thinkers who is saying it's not just about personal hatred of Jews, because anti-Semitism has existed in Europe for thousands of years, but what we saw with the Holocaust in his mind is something different, and it's where the bureaucratic state takes up these kind of ancient historical biases. So he's really examining the contemporary world. If anything, has become more bureaucratic. So in another one of his very influential books, Liquid Modernity, like many of the thinkers, I talked about this in the section on the French thinkers, in many ways he's a disillusioned Marxist, but unlike them, he doesn't give up. He just pivots a little bit. But in this book, he talks about the idea of liquid modernity, which I think is just such an interesting lens to look at things. So in his foreword, he says, "This seems to be a dystopia made to the measure of liquid modernity, one fit to replace the fears recorded in Orwellian and Huxleyan style nightmares." So Bauman clearly is extremely concerned about the state of society that he's living in. So he says, "The disintegration of the social network, the falling apart of effective agencies of collective action, is often noted and bewailed as the unanticipated side effect of the new lightness and fluidity of the increasingly mobile, slippery, shifty, evasive, and fugitive power." Okay, so in the beginning of Liquid Modernity, he talks about Marx, and that in Marx he actually says, for the revolution to come, we have to break down these structures that are holding us back. And Bauman doesn't talk a lot about this, but I will add it in here. The key structure that Marx wanted to break down was religion. Okay, so that idea that religion is a kind of bulwark against change, and so the idea of just break it all down and make it liquid. So Zygmunt Bauman's saying here, we've lived long enough now to see how dangerous this is when we're breaking down tradition and we're breaking down custom and religion. And I talk in my ritual class the loss of rituals like birth rituals, wedding rituals, funeral rituals, so on. So, but social disintegration is as much a condition as it is an outcome of the new technique of power. So he's saying this isn't a coincidence, this isn't a side effect. This is exactly what was wanted, that it would become so light and unanchored. So it says, but social disintegration is as much a condition as it is an outcome of the new technique of power, using disengagement and the art of escape as its major tools. Okay, so this idea that the powers that be like that people are disengaged. They like that they're pursuing escapism. Okay. For power to be free to flow, the world must be free of fences, barriers, fortified borders, checkpoints. Okay. So he's critiquing here globalization, right? That idea that the world should just be this open. Because what that really means is open for commerce. It doesn't mean that people from, North Africa can just walk into Italy. We know that's not the case. So it's about the movement of currency, really. So any dense and tight network of social bonds, and particularly a territorially rooted tight network, is an obstacle to be cleared out of the way. Okay, now you can see immediately what this would mean, for instance, for Indigenous rights. So there you have a community that's completely rooted in place, completely rooted, if they could maintain it against a lot of onslaught. This would be and we hear this language, they're standing in the way of progress, right? So this is definitely the logic of that liquid modernity, that all these ancient customs just need to be liquidated. And I often think of the case of someone I knew in Toronto. Their family owned property right in downtown Toronto, obviously worth a lot of money. And Pizza came to the mother and made her an offer of a huge amount of money. And she said no. And they became very angry with her. And she basically said, we don't need a pizza. We need something that gives back to the community of this area. And apparently the guy said, do you know who holds back progress? It's old people and hippies. And she said, well, I'm both, so you're out of luck. So I thought that was great. So I do want to say, as I've said throughout, people always push back, and groups of people always push back. I think I get why these critics are, you look around sometimes and it's daunting, but I think it's always very important. There's actually a guy online that does good news stories, like about improvements in the environment, things like that. I think we should do that more, because I think this can lead into a kind of despair. Certainly, Bauman never despaired. You don't write books if you're despairing, at least not books like this. And so I think he is overstating. I think many people are very rooted to where they're from and very connected to community, but definitely we are seeing I wasn't able to cover it in this course, unfortunately, but there's a whole growing body of work on loneliness, bowling alone, the vanishing neighbor, that's talking about the way people's social networks are breaking. And so I'll just give another example. If money is all I care about in my career, then yes, I'll leave my community and I'll go wherever I have to for my job, right? Now, sometimes obviously we have to do that, but I think people are increasingly rethinking if a raise is worth, uprooting yourself from your community. So one of the other central concepts within this chapter is corporatism and the rise of the corporation into a central role in our society. So I'm just giving a definition here: the organization of a society into industrial and professional corporations, serving as organs of political representation and exercising power within society, and even internationally, actually. So obviously corporations have been around for a long time, but we've seen sort of late 20th century and onward that they've gained an incredible amount of power. And there was a ruling that I believe in the US that said they had the right of persons. Very bizarre. And so they can sue, and they became these incredibly powerful entities. And as a result, they lobby, particularly in the United States. They have bottomless pockets, so they lobby politicians. And every now and then they'll release a list of these different politicians who've taken money from different corporations. So this, of course, is important, because then the politician is beholden to that corporation and may vote. So, for instance, if you've taken money from a coal mining company, you're probably going to vote against environmental regulations. So this has huge impacts in terms of society. And so, again, we're right in the middle of this. Some of you may have been seeing Meta just was on trial and got fined a huge amount of money for their practices around children and social media. So there again has been a pushback, but these guys are powerful, and as we well know, and they often, Canada tried to tax some of these corporations, and they basically said we were told that the United States wouldn't do a trade deal with us if we did that. So you can see the incredible power these corporations have into the present. So I'm going to be ending this lecture with two Canadians, which I feel is appropriate. And our thinkers seem to be very concerned with a lot of the same issues that people like Ritzer and Bauman are thinking about. So I want to start by looking at John Ralston Saul, who was born in Ottawa in 1947. He was educated at McGill and the University of London. And he's written a number of books and given public talks. He's another one who's not just speaking to other academics. He also is speaking to the public. And so he's written a lot on Enlightenment philosophers, which, as we talked about at the very beginning of the course, is the basis of much of many of these issues that we're dealing with right now. So, for instance, he wrote a book called Voltaire's Bastards, The Dictatorship of Reason in the West, which discusses how an excessive love of abstract reason has been used by the Western power elites to create institutions that are bureaucratic nightmares. Okay? So it's a critique of pure reason. And we've already talked about that. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because I talked about that when we looked at Weber, and we know where that can lead. He's also very critical of, this has really been coming out in the media, the sort of global elites, right, with the Epstein files and so on, that live this just completely life immune to the law, to normal decency. And so Saul was ahead of his time critiquing these people. And he said they build a wall between themselves and reality, so they live these very luxurious lives. I remember reading about the financial crisis, and that the really high-end bankers in New York, or finance guys, would go up in their own private elevator. So they didn't have to be in an elevator with normal people, God forbid. And so he says on the bottom of page 416, managerial elites manage Crises require active thought. We teach people how to manage, but not how to think. We actually punish thought as unprofessional. Now, this one makes my blood run cold, and I've already touched on this when we looked at Durkheim and Weber. So this is certainly, from my point of view, as somebody who works in the university sector, this is exactly what the university is supposed to be doing, is teaching people to think, not to manage people. And we're under direct attack. You're probably aware that the Faculty of Arts and Science in almost every university in North America is under direct attack for not being practical. So in many cases, the government wants us to turn you into corporate drones, and obviously that's not happening. So I can already tell from the discussion boards that's not happening. So I'm feeling good about that. So let's just look at this. The acceptance of corporatism causes us to deny and undermine the legitimacy of the individual as a citizen in democracy. And this has been an ongoing concern. Certainly voting rates are appalling in Canada. Like for your generation, just terrible. So even the most basic function of democracy, we're seeing many people aren't doing it. The result of such a denial is a growing imbalance, which leads to our adoration of self-interest and our denial of the public good. Now, again, he's being provocative here. He's panicking a little bit. You can feel it. I don't think this is completely true. And certainly, just as we have come into this maelstrom that we're living through right now, I have also seen things that make me feel like, in fact, people do still act as citizens. I just yesterday walked by the MP's office here, MP's office in town here, and there was a crowd outside protesting for environmental regulation. And then the OSAP protest last week outside the MPP's office. So people are still acting as citizens in a democracy. They're still making their ideas known, and they're changing things. They are. So if we look at, for instance, the travel boycotts and goods boycotts that Canadians just have completely grassroots taken as a result of the threat of tariffs from the United States, that all just was a grassroots reaction. That did not come from politicians at all. And so I get what he's saying here. I agree with him, but I do think people still act as communities, and particularly under duress. Often it takes something very extreme, but then people will get out in the street. I want to end with Naomi Klein, who is one of the most influential public intellectuals in the world. And she's somebody who, apparently she's written 9 books. You will actually see people walking around with them. So people actually read her books. She writes in a very approachable way. So she is also, I'm looking at her website here, the University of British Columbia Professor of Climate Justice. So in the textbook, he's talking about her, she started out really looking at corporatism. That was her most, probably still her most famous book is called No Logo. But she's obviously been doing this for a while, and so has been shifting. So she's talking much more about the environment. And so she and her husband, Avi Lewis, who is right now running for the leadership of the NDP, were part of the LEAP manifesto that were calling for a Green New Deal in Canada and, delinking from fossil fuels. They were very controversial in doing that, but they're looking better and better. And so this idea, I'm just giving an example on a Green New Deal here, but she's written many, many different books. And so what I'm going to do, just so you get a sense of her, is I'm going to try to find a good interview with her, and then I'll post it to Blackboard so you can get a sense of her. She was actually the editor of the Varsity at U of T when I was an undergrad, and there was always some controversy going on. So she's been a sort of left-wing journalist right from the beginning. So according to her website, her latest project is End Times Fascism and the Fight for the Living World. So she's combining the politics and the environmentalism here. My new book, End Times Fascism and the Fight for the Living World, co-written with Astra Taylor, will be published in September 2026. The far right is on the march again, but this time it's different from anything we've seen. A new apocalyptic alliance of religious fundamentalists, billionaire Silicon Valley tech kings, and ethno-nationalists is on the move. They're united in their belief that some kind of cleansing cataclysm is coming, and they welcome a future of shocks, scarcity, and collapse, convinced they'll be among the saved. Now, this is something I've also noticed. There's a certain group of people, I don't know if any of you have come across it, like the preppers that are, stockpiling soap and food, and it's almost like they're looking forward to this, which again chills my blood. So she says, this book, though harrowing in parts, is ultimately hopeful. Our research confirms that whether we are fighting polluting data centers or opposing forever wars, most of us desperately want a future we can believe in, and leaders who believe in us. The more end times fascism is exposed to the light, the weaker its hold will become. Okay, so again, as I said, these kind of writers, they're always hopeful, obviously, and they're trying to change people's minds and change people's actions. So Klein is, again, one of those very activist, involved writers, thinkers, and journalists. So as I said, I'll try to find a good interview with her and link it to Blackboard.